Assalamu alaikum. In the previous lecture, we have studied about desertification, and we have seen the definition of desertification and how desertification was recognized as a worldwide problem. In today's lecture, we're going to continue with desertification, and we're going to focus more on the causes and the consequences of this problem. Without further ado, let's start. If we look at desertification as a problem and go back to the definition which we have seen in the last lecture, that desertification is a land degradation caused by human and natural factors. And if we look at the human factors, we can see that it is actually interlinked between social, economic, cultural, and environment and institutional and political factors. Now, let's look at some examples of the causes of desertification. Desertification can be caused by deforestation, which is basically cutting down the trees of different uses. In some of the countries, the trees are cut for agricultural activities, like what happens in Canada and Indonesia, as you can see from these pictures. Deforestation can also happen when trees are cut for wood production or expansion for urban life. And this is a very clear that when the population is growing very high, there is a need to produce more food. And there is also a need for other purposes like wood production, which can be used for fuel or for nature or for other uses, and also expansion in cities due to the increase in the population, and that's basically what is called urbanization. Another cause of desertification is the overgrazing. And if we go back to the story of how the Bedouin, for example, were managing the land, we can see that the Bedouin in the past were only localized at certain areas, and they actually herd their goats or cattle or whatever for some season, and they leave that area. By doing so, they allow a kind of a time by which the grass can recover back. Overgrazing is different. Why? Because due to, again, the interest in producing more food, and the interest actually here resulted in concentrating the cattle or the goat at a certain area. And this actually increasing in the intensity of the number of the cattle or goats at that particular place and grazing over the time would actually lead to actually reducing the vegetation cover and maybe even killing the vegetation cover, by which it does not allow time for the vegetation to recover back, and therefore the soil becomes bare, and therefore it becomes susceptible to other climatic factors which can lead to erosion and hence the degradation of the land. Intensive farming is another example of the causes of desertification. When people intensify the agricultural production and focus at a certain area with the use of chemicals like pesticide and fertilizers, and with the continuous blowing, the soil become weak. And this is actually what makes the soil becoming loose and then susceptible for erosion, which later on actually create a depletion of the nutrient and also making the soil not stable. In some of the areas, particularly the coastal sites, people need more water, and therefore they overpump the groundwater, which can lead to salinization of the groundwater due to seawater intrusion. Improper management of the irrigation, like for example, excessive irrigation, can lead actually to overexploit the water resources. And this is actually, again, can interlink with overpumping, like depletion of the groundwater resources or cause of seawater intrusion at some of the areas. When the water becomes salinized, and if people keep irrigating with this poor quality water, it can further degrade the soil by increasing its salinity, and then it becomes not supporting for plant growth, because the salinity level can reach or can actually exceed the threshold value, the threshold level by which plant can endure salinity. Climate change is another thing which actually has been seen in the world, in various parts of the world. So basically, when climate change, there will be a change, for example, in the temperature, rainfall, and solar radiation pattern. And because of these things, some of the areas receive actually lots of rain, which can cause floods and erosion. In some parts of the world, some of the places, the temperature becomes very high, and also the evaporation rate is very high, and the rainfall is even scattered or rare. And because of that, these areas will be actually subjected to prolonged drought, which can actually end with like reduction in the water resources, and therefore when no water is there, no life will be at that particular area. According to some of the studies, the average river runoff and water availability are projected to increase by 10 to 40% at some of parts of the world, which basically located at the high latitude areas, like some of the wet tropical areas. Whereas the opposite is happening, 10 to 30% reduction of the average of the water availability will happen at the mid or lower latitude areas, which actually like dry tropics. When the temperature increase, there will be an effect on actually not only on the climatic issues, but some of the biological life in the soil, like the decomposition of organic matter and the soil moisture content. And that's actually would further make the soil like inhabitable. With the high temperature and high evaporation rate and low rainfall pattern, absolutely drought can happen, and therefore life become very difficult. Now, I want to spot your attention to something very important here, that the causes of desertification are actually interlinked, and they are more complicated than which we think about it. In the previous slides, I have presented for you some of the causes, but I presented to you as separate causes, separate factors. In reality, desertification, as I explained in the previous lecture, is a weak problem by which it's a very complicated problems, and the causes and the effect are interlinked to each other. So we cannot look at the problem by analyzing one cause only, but in reality, it is all interlinked and complicated. Now, remember the causes, and remember when we talk about human activities, we should not forget that human activities should include social, economic, cultural, and political and institutional activities. So let's look at the examples here and how it is actually interlinked. So some of the causes, anthropogenic causes, which means human causes, and natural causes. And remember that most important thing for us, that land degradation happens due to actually the human activities, because some of the areas are initially like have a very like, let's say, like a climate that is actually make them susceptible like the dry lands. But when human activities are imposed in those areas, the land become further degraded, and actually the rate of and actually the human activities accelerate the rate of degradation. Now let's look at the examples here. So we have agricultural activities, infrastructure extension, wood extraction, increased aridity, demographic factors, economic factors, technological factors, climate factors, policy and institutional factors, and cultural factors. So here are some examples of the factors, but let us build a story from these factors. Now, let's see how these factors are interlinked and make a story. So basically, if we look at the agricultural activities and take the first point, the first point is actually related to the livestock production. When the human population increase, there is a need actually for producing more food to meet actually the food demand. And because of that, there will be an increase in the livestock production, like raising of cattle, goats, and so on. By doing so, this actually can lead to overgrazing in some of the areas. Now, what will happen if in these areas there are other interests, like it's an area where you have overgrazing, but at the same area, actually the forests are cut for harvesting of fuel wood and actually raise other animals. Now, when you have these two activities, the situation is even farther worse. Now, imagine if we have actually an area, and in this area is basically you have a lot of agricultural activities like for raising animals, herding, and so on. And this area actually have some, let's say, summer trees. So these summer trees are also cut to produce actually charcoal, fahm. And the climate in this area is like Oman. There is a low rainfall pattern, and there's actually an impact of climate change by which there's a prolonged drought. Now, what will happen when you put all of these factors? Well, basically, it's further accelerate the process of land degradation. Now, let me give you another example. If we look at the demographic factor like the migration, when people cannot find in the rural areas proper jobs and so on, they start migrating in the cities. And because of this migration to cities, what will happen there? You have a huge number of population localized in that particular area. So therefore, there is a need for expansion of cities. And when the cities are expanding, it means there is a need for more land. So they cut the lands, they cut the trees, and there will be an expansion of the cities. Now we know that the human are actually doing a lot of activities, and from these activities, like the industrial activities and like many other activities, can lead to emit more carbon dioxide. When these carbon dioxide are emitted to the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, actually, they contribute to climate change. And when you have climate change, then it actually can increase the aridity in some of the areas because you will have a decrease in the rainfall pattern. Now imagine if you put any of these other factors together. So from this point, I'm trying to give you an example that the causes of desertification are all interlinked, and you can look at any one of these points and build a story how these actually are connected. Now, I want you actually to read them and to think how to how to connect the dots and make a story looking at the complexity. And I want you also to go back to the book, to this book, which is actually Partman et al., and which actually I put it for you in the model, and read a little bit from chapter 3, especially these points here, because it will explain to you the chart and how these actually interlink to each other. Okay, now let us continue. Now, if we take this statement, there is no one single factor that causes desertification or land degradation. Both biophysical and socio-economic factors should be considered, even jointly, as they interact and reinforce each other to induce transition trigger events. Related to this is the issue that it is often difficult or even impossible to separate natural from human-induced degradation. Now, think about this statement and think about how natural and anthropogenic causes are interrelated. Think about it for a minute, pause the video, and I will explain to you. Okay, the point here, what is meant actually from this statement, that actually the anthropogenic factors or human factors and the nature are actually all together. And what happens here that you cannot actually distinguish whether the cause of desertification is basically due to sometime due to natural or human factors. Why? Because sometime the border between them is very thin. Now, let me give you an example. Let me give you an example. So if we look at climate change, well, climate change actually is happened due to human activities. Now, if you have an area which is actually not, which is actually dry, and this area you have less vegetation cover, less vegetation cover, and there are some of the human activities. Now, when you can observe the desertification happens in this area and the land degradation happens, sometimes you cannot distinguish really what is happening here. You cannot distinguish whether this mainly is a cause of a climate change or other human activities or even a natural factors. And therefore, the best thing is actually to look at the problem from all different aspects and actually trying to understand the problem from its complexity point. So you have to consider the issue, you have to consider the area, and you have to look at the socio-economic, cultural, environmental, political, institutional factors that are all interlinked at that area, exactly like what you are doing here. And I will give you now a more example of these things. Now, if we look at this chart, it basically explains to you the following. So it shows you here, this square is desertification. And then it shows you two different cycles. Now you have a component of biodiversity involved in the linkage, and the blue one is a major service impacted by the biodiversity losses. Now, if you actually take any place, and you start building the story, it will lead to desertification, and desertification will actually go back to the same circle. Now, let me give you an example. Climate change. If we think about climate change, with the climate change, it can actually increase the reduction in the species abundance. That means that some of the, let's let's say like vegetation species or animal species will disappear. And when these, let's say, vegetation species disappear, then what will happen that there will be a change in the structure and the diversity, which at the end of the day lead to biodiversity losses. Now, when you have a biodiversity losses and you trace the link here, it can actually, it means that there will be a reduction in the plant and the soil organism diversity, which at the end of the day affect the whole ecosystem and can lead to desertification. Now, take a bath from any other places. Now, let's take the bath from soil erosion. If you have soil erosion, whatever the cause of soil erosion, then it can lead to a loss of nutrient and can actually affect the soil moisture regime in the soil, which actually can lead to biodiversity losses. And when you have a biodiversity losses, it can lead to a decrease in the plant diversity. Or you can take this bath, a new bath, reduce the structural diversity of vegetation cover and diversity of microbial species in the soil crust. When you have affect this biodiversity and the microbial life in the soil, then you are actually reducing the soil conservation, which lead to soil erosion. And soil erosion is part of desertification, can lead to desertification. Now, take the bath from any different ways that if you have soil erosion, it can also lead to reduce the carbon dioxide reserve in the soil and increase the emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Why? Because it means that you have less vegetation cover, and therefore it can lead to climate change, which can increase the flood and fires and create a lot of issues, which can at the end of the day come back and increase the erosion, also leading to desertification. So you can see the interlink between any one of these factors. So spend some time to it and try to understand how the loop is all interconnected. Now, if we look at the main causes of desertification, we can see that different parts of the world might encounter different causes of desertification. Why is that? Think about it. Now, let's take the example at the beginning. Now, if we look at Asia, this chart actually explained to you here the causes of desertification: blue, overgrazing, then deforestation, agricultural activities, and so on. So if you look at Asia, you will see that the highest cause is the blue one, which is overgrazing. If you look at Europe, you will see that the highest one is the blue one, which is overgrazing. If you look at Africa, you can find also the overgrazing. If you look at this place, you can find also that you have overgrazing. If you look at South America, you can find that you have this green one, which is deforestation. If you look at North America, you can see that you have this green color, which is the agricultural activities. Now, why do you have differences in the causes of desertification? Think about it for a moment. If you go back to the definition of desertification, you will find that the human activities, which actually include social, economic, cultural, institutional, and political factors. Now think about it for a second. Do people have the same cultural, social, economical, political, and institutional factors in all of the countries? No, of course. Each of the countries have different cultures, have different attitude, have different conditions, environmental conditions, climatic conditions, and therefore the causes of desertification might differ. And this actually brings us back to a very important concept that there is no single bullet solution to the problem. Why? You cannot have a solution that, and then you can generalize the solution for all parts of the world. You have to fit this solution and you have to understand the problem in each part of the world because the causes of the problem differ. And it becomes more complicated because you are involving human, which is a very dynamic, a very diverse activities and many other factors. Now, let's look at the impacts of desertification. The impact of desertification, one of them is actually the losses of the agricultural productivity of the land. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification estimate that a moderate desertification can lead to 10 to 25% decrease in the agricultural productivity. Why that, do you think? It's basically because when you have desertification, it can actually lead to, let's say, degrading the soil fertility and loss of the nutrient, like what you can see here. Imagine you have actually less vegetation cover, then it becomes susceptible for soil erosion. And with soil erosion, the fertility, lots of nutrients are actually eroded and the soil structure become like not stable. And then a lot of other problems might happen. Not only that, but some of the soils might encounter soil salinity issues, like what happens in this picture. When you have a lot of salinity beyond the threshold of the plants, then there will be less vegetation, less plants can endure that condition and can survive, and therefore the cover will become actually unprotected. And then it will be subjected to any of these factors, like wind erosion and other things. In some parts of the world, when the vegetation cover is lost and when you have extreme events like winds and so on, then they can encounter sandstorm events like what you can see in these pictures: UAE, Nigeria, USA, and even Oman. In some parts of the world, desertification can cause a loss of the arable land, which makes food insecurity in the areas and loss of jobs. And because of that, people start fighting, and then it can create poverty and war. So this is basically about this lecture. The take-home message that desertification is actually the primary cause of 70% of the total agricultural land loss. And it's basically, it has actually is caused by other social, environment, and cultural problems in the drylands. We as human are the main driver for these problems. Therefore, we cannot exclude human activities. And another very important thing, we have to look at all the activities together. The biophysical, socioeconomic factors should be all considered together. And the causes of desertification might differ from one place to another, from continent to another, because you have diversity in the biophysical and the socio-economical factors. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Go back to this actually book and read a little bit and watch this video. So thank you and take care. Bye.